Ladies and gentlemen, I suppose we can slowly start our today meeting of Richard Pipe's laboratory. For me, it's a great pleasure to start this meeting today and to welcome warmly our guest, Professor Nikos Marantsidis from University of Macedonia. I'll also want to welcome, of course, I will just leave the floor for Dr. Magdalena Samczushin. I'm sure that Magda will introduce Professor in a second. Today we will discuss one of the books written by Professor Marantsidis under the Stalin shadow. So Magda, the floor is yours, and I will just stay here and listen carefully the discussion on that interesting topic.
Okay, thank you. Hello and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And thanks to the organizers, I have a great pleasure to chair today's meeting and welcome our guest, Professor Nikos Marantsidis from the University of Macedonia in Thessaloniki, Greece. Thank you, Professor, again for accepting our invitation and willing to spend some time with Polish audience. We are very pleased. And in a moment, Professor will give us a lecture, as my colleague said, on his latest book, Under Stalin's Shadow, A Global History of Greek Communism, published last year by Cornell University Press. But first, let me say a few words about our guest. Professor Nikos Marantsidis is a political scientist working in the Department of Balkan, Slavic and Eastern Studies, University of Macedonia. He has written many important and interesting articles and books in the field of political science studies and contemporary history of Greece, especially as it comes to the subject of communism movement. Well, I did some research, and as far as I noticed, Professor Marantsidis has been traveling a lot. He studied in Paris, worked in Prague. He did his research in Polish, Czech, British, Romanian archives. So I can only guess this can be a reason or one of the reasons why his view of research has a global dimension. And we met about 10 years ago, or even more than 10 years ago, when together with Professor Andrzej Paczkowski, we organized a Polish-Greek seminar here in Poland. The seminar was devoted to the fate of Greek refugees who left their homeland after civil war in Greece and found themselves also in Poland. And this street of Greek refugees, is also mentioned in the latest Professor book, Under Stalin's Shadow, but this is just a tiny piece of it. The book tells a comprehensive history of Greek Communist Party from its foundation till 1956. And I would like to say that for me, it's not just a history of one National Communist Party. This book can be some kind of inspiration for us on how to, let me say it very generally, to write political history in order to better understand not only the past, but also present. I was thinking about it from the very beginning when I was reading this book, which begins with a reflection on the communism after the collapse of the Soviet Union. But okay, maybe for now I put full stop here. And before I give the floor to our guest, I would like to kindly remind that after the lecture, there will be a discussion, and all of you, dear participants, can ask questions or do comments by raising hand or writing them in a chat. So, okay, so let's start. Professor Marantsidis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Magdalena. I'm really glad to be here with all of you, even through internet and through this distance. But it's really nice to share and to give these lectures and to share ideas and thoughts on Greek communism. And for this situation, I'm really, I would like to thank so much the Institute of Political Science of the Polish Academy of Science for inviting me to this meeting, to this event. And of course, I would like particularly to thank Magdalena Sędzierzyn. I'm sorry about my bad pronunciation in Polish, for the whole organization, and of course for the kind words and the introduction on my book, on my last research. There is another reason that I'm happy for this meeting, for this lecture, and the reason is that I think I can share with you the thread of how this book was written. And I feel this need, if you like, because the beginning of my book story, the beginning, I could say that started almost 20 years ago, and this beginning has a particular Polish aspect. In fact, it was in Paris in 2005, in a conference about international communism. I don't remember in which university we were there, when I've been fortunate to meet Professor Andrzej Paczkowski, who I didn't at that time know him. He came to me and he kindly provided me with a crucially important Polish document on the Greek Civil War. I don't know Polish. I couldn't be able to read the document and what exactly and why exactly this document was so important, as Professor Paczkowski told me. The document located in the Institute of National Remembrance, the famous CPN, detailed the material and financial help sent to the communist guerrilla in Greece by four People's Republic, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania, during the years 1948-1950, years where in Greece we had civil war. This document proved to be of critical importance for my research on the Greek Civil War. Written in Polish and signed by President Bierut and General Komar, the report, which was delivered to Stalin, reveals in detail the nature and total cost of the aid procured by the Cominform for the Greek communist guerrilla. The report opened to me a window to see Greek communism wider and clearer in a different light, if you like, from international, let's say, global perspective. This was the first but critical path for me to think on a new research project concerning the relations between Greek communism and the international communist system, the international communist world, since the very first moment, since the very beginning of the creation of the Greek Communist Party. So in my lecture today, I will focus on the book's content, of course, but trying to highlight the importance, the significance to analyze a national communist party, the Greek one in our case, from international perspective. I think that it is important for not only methodological reasons, but also for the better understanding of the history of international communism, to try to understand the national communist parties always through their international connections and their relations with the center. We talk about this later. So my question, focusing on the Greek Communist Party, started, as Magdalena told you before, when I had my first questions about the political behavior of the Greek Communist Party, the KKE, as we say in Greece, after 1989. And it is important to say that during the moment, after the moment that communism was fall everywhere in Europe, and the communist parties in Western Europe decided to change their names and to radically change identity, one party, and this was the Communist Party of Greece, followed a different path. This party was not eager to denounce its longtime heroes. In February 1991, after passionate and traumatizing debates, the majority of the KKE members decided the old communists had been right, and the reformers wrong. The party denounced the anti-socialist treason, as they said, of the reformist Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, and refused to do away with its communist names, symbols, and identity. Although the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics was now dead, its specter continued to haunt the KKE. The question here is, in at least for me, it was very clear. What led this party to present such idiosyncratic devotion to the Bolshevik legacy? And of course, I'm a political scientist, that I could think different. I could develop different kind of hypotheses. For example, we could think of it as a domestic electoral strategy. The KKE bet on retaining the allegiance of an aging electorate, suspicious of reform and full of nostalgia for a heroic revolutionary past. We could also note that the KKE was not just an ordinary party, but one purporting to provide a secular religion, and thus debase in its own sense could only prove disastrous for the organization. But I think that neither of those explanations addresses the core of the 1990s Stalinist revival in the Communist Party of Greece. So I tried to understand, and I decided to follow a different path, a historical, if you like, path, trying to understand this political behavior. And I think that party's history is critical to understand what happened today in the presence, what was happening with the KKE's culture and identity. And it is important to say that the first methodological point that I would like to stress is that when we talk about the histories of the European Communist parties, it is important to say that we cannot be easily categorized, placed neatly in boxes in which we tend to confine stories about the past. In writing histories of communist parties, we should resist, I think, traditional dichotomies between national and international historical perspectives, between the local and the global. For its birth, revolutionary socialism had disavowed narrowly nationalistic narratives and raised fundamental questions on internationalism, linking the national and the global spheres of thought and action, involving geographically distant communities in networks and revolutionary projects. And this was more clear when we talk and when we see the model of socialism that was developing in the Soviet Union and gave and took the name of communism after 1990. So in this type of socialist trend, this type of socialist movement, the communist movement, we saw how those revolutionaries organized themselves into national communist parties, which in turn produced sociopolitical communities parallel to national societies that a French historian, Annie Crisel, called them contre-société, anti-society, we could say. Those communities bore simultaneously values, visions, and social practices foreshadowing a future society and sets of norms, rules, networks of social capital, and selection mechanism in line with actual needs and the national framework which encompassed them. In other words, those parties embraced a vision of the future that defined existing national frontiers, centering instead on transnational linkages between the workers of the world. As members of national communist parties, such individuals simultaneously belong to the Comintern structures defined by an international hierarchy with Moscow at center. As a result, the Communist parties passed simultaneously, and this is, I think, the most important methodological point to say, their past belongs to the fields of local, national, transnational, international, and global history simultaneously. So my book represents, I think, a first systematic attempt to examine in detail Greek communism from a global history perspective. It traces the KKA's interaction with the communist parties in neighboring states in the Balkans and with the Comintern, the Cominform later, the Soviet Union and the Bolsheviks during the years 1918 to 1956. The book is divided into two parts. The first part covering the years 1918 to 1939 until the break of the Second World War, focuses on the role played by the Comintern and the Balkan Communist Federation in the KKA's transformation from a minor socialist party to a significant domestic political force and traces the party's early immersion in the international communist world. The second part of the book, from 1939 to 1956, covers the turbulent and transformative time of the Second World War and the early years of the Cold War. The book ends with the famous 20th Congress of the Soviet Communist Party, where Nikita Khrushchev denounced the crimes of Stalinism. The KKA was born in a turbulent moment when the communist world has just begun taking shape. While it originated in 1918 as a typical socialist party, the KKA became one of the European Communist parties most loyal to Moscow. By the mid-20th century, the KKA had embraced the spirit of Soviet internationalism more ardently than any other party in Western Europe. While other communist parties embarked on their national roads towards socialism, as at that time we called the differentiation of style and line coming from different communist parties toward Moscow, the KKA maintained unusually strong relations with Moscow and with its East European sister parties. I can say that no other West European Communist Party experienced such an intimate contact with the USSR and with the People's Republics for so many years. Because of this unique distinction, the Communist Party of Greece should not be considered as a typical Western European Communist Party, but both simultaneously a Western and an Eastern European organization. The KKE is a Western party by virtue of Greece's international orientation, but it is East European, but its own history as a party. In fact, from 1947 to 1974, which is 27 years, due to the civil war and its defeat in 49, the Communist Party of Greece, the party's headquarters of the KKE, were in three different East European capitals. Initially in Belgrade from 1947 to 1948, later on in Bucharest from 1948 to 1968 for 20 years, and finally in Budapest from 1968 to 1974. The KKE's leadership and dozens of thousands of its followers were living for decades in a vast area extended from Stettin in Poland to Tashkent in Uzbekistan, a refugee land, as a veteran Greek communist and historian Ilios Yannakakis has called it, experiencing life and politics under existing communist authorities. It was in those regions, geographically and politically very close to the Moscow center, that the KKE experienced the turbulent developments unfolding in the communist bloc. As a consequence, the dramatic developments that shook the post-war European communist world, including Khrushchev's rise and fall, the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, the Prague Spring, and the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, the dramatic events in Poland during the 70s and the early 80s were felt by the Greek communists not merely as events of historical significance, but as traumatic collective experiences whose impact affected their own situation powerfully and directly. Even though the KKE was deeply entangled in the web of worldwide communism, readers are not likely to learn about those interconnections from scholarly books for many time. In fact, before my book, the last book in English on the subject was published in 1989. It was the book of Peter Stavrakis with the title Moscow and Greek Communism, edited in Cornell University Press, a very interesting book. But the problem with this book, it was its lack of documents, because at the time that Peter Stavrakis, a very well-known Greek historian, wrote his book, it was impossible to find documents from the archives in Eastern Europe in the ex-communist world. So this situation, we could say, pushed me, if you like, to assume this task and to try to write a history of the Greek communism using a lot of these archives, of these materials that came from different ex-people republics, and of course from Moscow and the ex-USSR. It is interesting to say that, judging by regular political standards, KKE's history is one of the most turbulent and tragic European communism had experienced. For instance, only the KKE among European communists could probably claim the world's record in dramatic party leadership turnover. From its creation in 1918 until 1956, the 10 persons who led the party were all forcibly deposed and expelled from the party. And the last two, Andronikos Haitas and Nikos Zachariadis, also both suffered tragic deaths. Haitas was among the victims of the Stalinist purges in the 30s, and Zachariadis' suicide in exile in Siberia in 1973, being expelled from the party 16 years earlier. So the highly irregular and violent fate of the KKA's top leaders reflected a particular turbulent political life of the party. Long before its military bid for power during the Civil War's years in 1946 to 1949, the KKA had been transformed from a party rooted in social democratic traditions into a disciplined Stalinist organization that became completely subservient to Moscow and its obedient organs. That is not to say that the KKA was merely a pawn, if you like, in the power games of communist agencies. In reality, the situation was more complex. The international institutions such as the Comintern, the Balkan Communist Federation, later the Cominform, the sister parties in the Balkans, were not merely external factors determining the KKA's policies. Rather, those institutions, as well as the geopolitical interest of the Soviets and of the sister parties, all shaped the KKA's leadership, its character, its way of life, and its decision-making mechanisms over the years. Unavoidably, this process was full of internal conflicts. The Greek communists were pulled apart by centrifugal domestic and international forces emerging from political developments in Greece, in the Balkans, in the Soviet Union, and of course in the shifting dynamics of the international order. Between its birth in 1918 and the 1931 Comintern's intervention into its internal affairs, intervention which among others imposed in the KKA's the leadership of Nikos Zachariadis, who had been in Moscow in this time, the Greek party underwent a series of internal crises related to its public profile, its policies, and its model of management. While seemingly no more than petty quarrels in reality, all these conflicts concern the very nature of party's Bolshevization, as the Comintern called the process of homogenization and centralization imposed upon its member parties. In short, the crucial debates within the KKA pivoted at that time around the question of whether loyalty to Moscow's version of socialism and to the Comintern should determine every aspect of the party's life, organization, and policies. The internal debates about the reformist or the revolutionary road, the attitudes towards social democracy, or the Comintern's intrusive role in the party's affair were different components of the Bolshevization process. However, by far the most divisive issue within the party and its relations with its sister parties proved to be the Macedonian question. Probably you know that the Balkan Communist Federation in November 1923 decided in favor of a united and autonomous Macedonia and imposed the task to the Communist Party of Greece to promote the self-determination of the Macedonian nation, even if this meant the secession of a party of the Greek territories in northern Greece, what we call Greek Macedonia. So the party was in a very difficult situation, adopted, but not without hesitations and reactions, the decision of the Comintern and the Balkan Communist Federation, but the party adopted this decision only 1 year later. And it was exactly the same moment that the party decided to change its name from Socialist Labour Party of Greece, SEKE, which was the original name, to Communist Party of Greece, KK. And this is very interesting, if you like, the moment that the party decided to adopt a decision on the Macedonian question, decision critically of critical importance about the fate of the communist movement in Greece, it was this moment that the party decided to call itself Communist Party. And it is the moment of the absolute identification of the party organization with the external, instances, the international instances of the communist movement. The consequences of this position on the Macedonian independence, on the Macedonian issue, of course, were very harsh for the Greek party when we talk on domestic policy. And the gravest threat came in 5 years later in 1929, when the enactment of the law calling in Greece Idionymo law. It was the full name of this law was Law on Security Measures for the Social Status and the Protection of Civil Liberties. In fact, with this law, punished with prison or exile those who advocated the violent overthrow of the regime or the secession of any part of the country, an apparent reference to the Macedonian issue. And this decision followed, and the consequences of this decision of the Macedonian issue followed the Communist Party for 10 years until December 1935, when the Sixth Congress of the party decided to change its position on the issue and introduce the slogan of complete equality for the minorities. But in reality, we could say that the consequences of this policy were following Kukue's life for many years. I can say until the end of the Cold War, excuse me. Since 1931, there was a qualitative change, and 31 again, I repeat, it is the years that the Comintern decided to intervene upon the Communist Party and to put in place a new leadership, and it is the moment that Nikos Zachariadis became the number one of the party. So at this moment, there is a qualitative change in the relations between the KKE and Moscow. Moscow selected and advanced a new generation of KKE leaders. Their average age was only 27 years old, which means they had no personal memories of the socialist movement of the Second International era. Without ties to the Western European socialist movement, as had been the case with the founding generation of the SEKE, the previous generation of the socialist leadership and communist leadership in Greece, these officials were pure products of the Soviet war. They had lived in Russia and had attended the Moscow schools. Some spoke Russian fluently, some others could understand Russian, could read Russian language, and almost all had a particular, I can say, link with Russian culture. Therefore, after 1931, the KKA's internal culture and the education and acculturation of its cadres underwent a profound Russification. And it is from this moment that this aspect that I call Russification changed dramatically the whole culture of the party and strongly create linkages between the party and the Moscow Center. The Second World War dramatically changed the role of the communist parties in the Balkans, including Greece, of course, especially in Yugoslavia, Greece, and Albania, due to their leading role in the resistance against the Axis forces. The communists became ambitious and significant protagonists of their respective post-war national political scene. But while the Yugoslav and the Albanian leaders Tito and Hoxha succeed in their dreams of establishing and heading socialist communist regime in their countries, the Greek leaders failed to do so. And this was not for lack of trying. Rather, Soviet policy in the Balkans, shaped by the consequences of Stalin's and Churchill's spheres of influence power politics, impeded the KKA's bid for power and compelled the party to seek temporary compromise with its rivals. However, many in the party were unwilling to accept the post-war international order contemplated by the Western allies, rejecting a British-supported centrist conservative regime. The KKA leaders stumbled into an armed uprising in Athens in December 1944, only a few months after the liberation of the country from Nazism, which was suppressed largely by British troops. However, Stalin did not appreciate KKA's involvement in the Battle of Athens. In 1945, as Dimitrov noted in his diary, Stalin commented Greek developments as follows: I advised not starting this fighting in Greece. The Hellas, the resistance organization, the army resistance organization led by the Communist Party, the Hellas people should not have resigned from the Papandreou national unity government. They have taken more than they can handle. They were evidently counting on the Red armies coming down to the Aegean. We cannot do that. We cannot send our troops to Greece either. The Greeks, the Greek communists, meant Stalin, have acted foolishly. Their defeat in the armed confrontation with their adversaries did not quell the ambition of the KKA. As the Allies' victory over Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan began morphing into an East-West Cold War, the Soviet Union shifted its view on the future of the Balkans, which, with the exception of Greece, were now ruled by Moscow-dominated regimes. Growing US-Soviet hostility combined with the KKA's and Tito's aggressive ambitions for the political future of the region prompted Moscow to become more responsive to the Balkan comrades' demands for increasing assertive policies in the region. However, in 1946, it was not Stalin who imposed his will upon the Greek party. On the contrary, despite initial Soviet reservation towards an armed conflict in Greece, it was the Greek Yugoslav Communist Party's common strategy, backed by the Bulgarian leader Dimitrov and the Bulgarian Communist Party, which persuaded a reluctant Stalin to endorse a communist revolution in Greece. The Greek Civil War was the first and the only hot war of the Cold War on the European continent. For much of the rest of the war, this conflict was a harbinger of a new kind of localized war in which external factors actually played a decisive role, a phenomenon that would become known as proxy war. The intervention of Western powers in the Greek conflict and the extensive assistance received by the Greek government, initially from Great Britain and subsequently by the United States under the Truman Doctrine and the Marshall Plan, is widely known in the scholars' literature because of its official intergovernmental nature, the wide publicity it generated, as well as its magnitude. Excuse me. On the other hand, and in part because of the secrecy that surrounded it and the resulting paucity of documentary evidence, the Eastern Bloc's involvement in the Greek crisis has until recently remained a relatively unexplored issue. Yet, as this book has demonstrated, the fellow communists were deeply involved. Backed by Stalin's faint green light, the Yugoslav at the beginning and then gradually the Bulgarian, the Romanian, and the Albanian comrades organized a huge military aid operation. Such extensive international involvement has been rare in 20th century civil conflicts and until that point virtually non-existent. Even compared to the aid given to the Spanish Democratic government during the civil war in Spain 1936 to 1939, the assistance offered to the KKE required a far more complicated and riskier strategizing, and this assistance, like never before, truly determined the course and the outcome of the events. For the KKE, the Tito-Stalin split in 1948 spilled a real catastrophe. Tito had been for the Greek communists their staunchest foreign supporter, and most of the assistance for the insurgency was coming from or through Yugoslavia. Gradually, the other people's republics took over the task of assisting the communist cause in Greece. As already suggested, the aid operation was an exceptionally complex, almost titanic task with unprecedented financial, logistical, political, and even intelligence challenges. The operation was involving not only the rest of the Balkan countries with the exception of Yugoslavia, but from 1948 also Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Hungary. Poland was the coordinating supply center. In the summer of 1948, the Polish Secret Service began an operation codenamed S, coordinated by the Second Bureau of the General Command of the Polish Army. The purpose of Operation S was to provide enough supplies for a guerrilla army of 50,000 troops. Between October 1948 and September 1949, for almost a year, 12 ships left Poland carrying 14,000 tons of war supplies and fuel, and as well as 30,000 tons of food and other items. Another 12 shipments were airlifted from Polish airports carrying explosives and medical supplies. For this, Poland paid 4 billion zloty, which is roughly 15 to 16 million in US dollar in today's US dollars, which constituted between 8 and 9% of its annual military spending. So it was a huge operation. There is no doubt on this. The civil war in Greece happened the way it did because of this remarkably auspicious for the KKE coalitions of international factors. However, in the new and unstable international context of the early Cold War, Zachariadis, the KKE leader, and his comrades chose to overestimate whatever they saw as a positive sign and to underestimate or to ignore those factors, suggesting that they would encounter obstacles and difficulties in their ambitious plan to overthrow the regime in Greece and develop a socialist Greece. In particular, they consider the existence of the Balkan People's Republics as a decisively positive condition for the success of the revolution, while they underestimate the determination and capacity of the United States to support the Greek government in defeating the communist revolt. Given how tightly the Greek communists had been integrated in the international communist world, it would be naive to claim that a communist insurgency could erupt in Greece without the consent of their Soviet and Balkans comrades. This discussion, this debate, whether, in other words, the Soviet Union gave a green light, political support, and material aid to the Greek communists, dominated the historical and public debate in Greece during the 70s and 80s. Now, I could say that this discussion is ended, but it would be equally naive to assume that such a fortuitous confluence of positive factors in the communist war would last forever. International support for the Democratic Army, the guerrilla army of the KKE, was conditional. It depended on the fluctuations in international geopolitics, especially in a region as particular as the Balkans and the Eastern Mediterranean. In reality, international support was tied to the prospect of the Democratic Army's success and the resulting profits, material, political, and ideological, the communists worldwide could expect to obtain. The Greek communists, therefore, had to prove they could win the war with their guns and bodies. In a proxy war, there are many countries happy to offer encouragement and even some support and share the spoils of victory, but none want to associate too closely with a loser. In August 1949, the defeated communist guerrilla, some accompanied by their families, were in retreat and on the move. Of the 80,000 who left Greece for the communist side of the Iron Curtain, not all were fighters. Some 25,000 had fought with the Democratic Army of Greece, while the rest were civilians who, willingly or not, joined the journey north. Relatives of the combatants, inhabitants of the northern borderlands who had lost their homes, even several hundred captive officers and soldiers of the National Army, and last but not least, some 28,000 children whom the KKE had already begun to evacuate to Eastern Europe since 1948. In February of that year, around 5,000 children had left Greece, hid in the People's Republic, but the relocation of all these people from Greece lasted several years, with the last refugees arriving at their final destinations only in 1950. Excuse me. who could organize such a large-scale operation? Obviously, it was the Comminform countries that undertook the enormous challenge of coordinating and providing for the safe transport of the numerous refugees from Greece. The USSR and almost all of the People's Republic worked together in coordination to host the displaced. The exception was Albania, which accommodated in its territory only a few dozen wounded Greek guerrillas and 300 soldiers of the Greek National Army who had been taken prisoner. The USSR, Poland, and Czechoslovakia hosted around 12,000 to 30,000 people each, Romania around 9,000, Bulgaria 6,000, Hungary 7,800 to 8,000, and East Germany 1,000 to 1,500, mostly children. Although not cooperating with the Comminform, Yugoslavia hosted almost 20,000 people, mostly ethnic Macedonian refugees. Between July 1949 and January 1950, 30,000 people departed Albania by ship and headed to Poland. On board the Polish ships Kosciuszko, Wisla, Legistrand, Białystok, I'm sorry for my bad pronunciation, they traversed the Mediterranean, passed the Gibraltar, circled around Western Europe, and reached the Polish port on the Baltic Sea. The Poles settled the refugees primarily in the previously heavily German-populated regions of Lower Silesia and Western Pomerania. While life for the displaced from Greece was clearly not easy, the same cannot be said of the KKE leaders, with the financial burden fully assumed by the Romanian party. The KKE leadership was installed close to the Comminform headquarters in Bucharest, where they acted as if they were the elite of another communist state. Zachariadis, for instance, was housed on Avenue Gratina Bordei in the city's red neighborhood, close to the Romanian nomenclatura. In their relative comfort, the KKE leaders engaged in extended discussions about the insurgency collapse and deliberated on their options and next steps. They perceived their defeat in Greece as temporary, but were not so unrealistic as to consider their situation unchanged. Instead, they developed a peculiar dual strategy, aiming for both revolution and peace at the same time. Given its shaky foundation, the new strategy appeared contradictory and unrealistic. It prefers to pursue a bizarre mixture of objectives: an aggressive revolution from abroad with unspecified international implications and risk, combined with lawful participation in electoral and parliamentary politics at home. However bizarre it may seem in retrospect, this war and peace strategy was not concocted by the intransigent Greeks themselves, but was derived from Andrei Zhdanov's Comminformian theory of the two international camps, which was being prominently discussed at that time. As a consequence, the civil war and its catastrophic outcome for the KKE changed radically how Greek communists could engage in their country's domestic politics. Two parallel political centers emerged: the old KKE leadership, now exiled in Bucharest, and a remarkably resilient left-wing political party functioning under the umbrella of a new party created in 1951 in Greece called EDA, which means Unified Greek Left. At that moment, there was impossible to create a communist party in Greece. Use the term communist was not allowed, and it was impossible for the communist followers and voters to vote for a communist party. But it was allowed, it was lawful to create a party named leftist and vote for it. They separate and different interest structures and ideological positions generated significant friction for all Greeks devoted to the cause of communism. The old KKE leaders no longer commanded absolute authority over the movement because they were abroad, they were in Eastern Europe. As such, authority was now fragmented, not merely politically, but almost also geographically. This created a lot of frictions between the two different centers, Bucharest and Athens. Nevertheless, as long as the world of international communism itself had a clear center of authority, the KKE leadership in Bucharest could stay off a full-fledged crisis and navigate the incompatible desires of their bifurcated, divided membership. The destalization process and the uncertainties it generated exacerbated the internal rift in the ranks of the Greek Communist Party. For the time being, the differences were mitigated when Zachariadis, who as Stalin's favorite had imposed his will on party politics, was removed from power in 1956. One year later, he was expelled from the party. As soon after, was sent in exile in Surgut in Siberia, where he committed suicide and died, as I told you before, in August 1973. Zachariadis was a special kind of leader, born and raised in two different empires outside the Greek borders. His knowledge of Greece and the Greeks was superficial, distorted, and dated. He was a product of a unique life commitment to Bolshevism, to Stalinism, which nurtured his faith in strict discipline, self-confidence, and directed his activism towards loyal service to the Communist Center. He was bright, energetic, stubborn, arrogant, inflexible, and believed to have been, not without some justification, one of Stalin's favorite foreign comrades. He regarded himself as a loyal and valuable instrument of Bolshevism, Stalinism, and the Greek communist movement's undisputed leader. He was overawed by Soviet ingenuity, power, decisiveness, organization discipline, and endless dynamism. On the other hand, he lacked understanding of and appreciation for the strengths and capabilities of the West, in particular of post-war America, to mobilize its vastly superior resources and industry and project its influence upon small states like Greece in order to block the further expansion of Soviet-controlled communism, then perceived as the West's moral enemy. One deprived of Stalin's backing, Zachariadis felt betrayed by his Greek comrades and abandoned by Stalin's successors who had their own agendas and favorites. Ironically, the little Stalin's end, the little Stalin Zachariadis was called and little Stalin. The little Stalin's end was brought about by the very tools he had so much faith in, blind obedience and loyalty rather than genuine consideration of policy, cynical exploitation of people's grievances rather than the real democratic input. Those tools were, of course, those of his Bolshevik hero. Fundamentally, it was Zahariadis and the KKE communist internationalism that shaped both his meteoric rise and his tragic fall. As a component of this complex and unstable international communist world, the KKE faced a daunting and dangerous task. It had to simultaneously respect Moscow as the fountainhead and arbiter of international communism, promote the international cause, and defend the Soviet Union's strategic interest as defined by Moscow's top leaders, while at the same time developing a cohesive and respectable party capable of gaining power or at least competing effectively in the domestic political and electoral arena. Given the realities of pre-war and post-war Greece, those ambitions proved excessively demanding, if not contradictory and unrealistic. After the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, everywhere in global communism faced a fatal hit. The center, the reference point of the system demised, and as noted an American sociologist, Martin Lipset, in 1964, without a global party with its center in Moscow, the communist, said Martin Lipset, the communists would be like the Roman Catholic Church without a pope. From that point on, the communist left entered in protracted period of turmoil and self-doubt. As everywhere else in Europe, the collapse of the Soviet bloc triggered a big crisis within the Greek communist movement. Some parties, as probably you know, like the Italian PC, the Communist Party, decided to abandon their communist identity. Some others, like the French PCF, tried to keep some distances from the past without totally throwing away the whole system. The KKE remained loyal to its Marxist-Leninist identity and the communist past without showing any regret. In February 1991, at the party's 13th Congress, the hardliners won a close but decisive victory. Thus, the KKE remained the last Stalinist party in Europe. The Greek left, however, experienced another revival with the rise of Syriza, the coalition of the radical left, who profited from the political volatility caused by the 2008 financial crisis, the Greek bankruptcy, and the absence of the Soviet Union factor as well. But this is another factor. Thank you so much.
Yes, hello. Thank you, Professor, for fascinating lecture. I'm sure that we have just learned many interesting and new things that broaden the perspective of the history of Greek communism and communism as itself and its reception, which in various countries, also in the Eastern Bloc, had its own local specificity, as you said. I have some questions, but I won't use my privilege of speaking first. But I would like to invite and encourage all of you to ask questions or make comments. So, are there any questions, please? One is in the chat, but it's okay. So, and another one. I need to check. So the first one I will read. I have a question about left-wing opposition against KKE after the war, or which books in any language would you recommend? I had some names of leftists who were killed, who are unknown to me, but I read also the Cordelius Castoriadis was arrested in 1940s by communists. It's a question from Jakub Vorońcow. And another one from Dr. Mariusz Zajączkowski, he wrote it to me on the chat. What were the relations between Communist Party of Yugoslavia and the Communist Party of Greece and their partisans units in the Macedonia in the period 1941 to 1945? Two questions. Any others? So maybe they will, but while listening, I had the impression that things that seemed distant or even I will say exotic to me, such as the specific conditions in which the Greek communist movement was born and existed, it still provoked me in my mind to compare Greece with Poland and look for similarities and differences. And I came up with an idea that one of the many differences between our countries was, I would say, the process of international ideological transformation of communist activists. I mean, Greek communists devoted a lot of attention to the theoretical issues of the movement. While in Poland, I think that party leaders very quickly turned into bureaucrats, and I suppose that this has happened because the Greek communists did not have the opportunity to manage state apparatus. But I also see a great need for them to define what communism actually was. And at least this is my impression. So maybe two questions from me. We are still waiting for another one, but the first also concerns the Macedonia or Macedonians. As you said, as we know, Macedonian issue was a big problem because it not only for Greece, because it involved also Bulgaria and Yugoslavia. And however, I'm curious what Stalin's role was in the Macedonian question. I mean, are there any materials that say what Stalin himself thought about this issue? Did he traditionally, as he did in other countries, want to play off ethnic conflicts and for his own purposes? So the question is, can we say something more about Stalin's ideas regarding the Macedonian issue? And the second and last question concerns present day and Communist Party, which operates in Greece as a KKE. You mentioned it. I'm wondering on what is the KKE trying to build its electorate today. I mean, what attracts people to it? Anti-European Union rhetoric or something more? Okay, so I think that's nobody. Okay, so please.
Okay, I will try to answer to these questions, and probably we have other questions during the time I answer. Of course, I can answer later to other questions. So I start from the end. What is the today electoral performance and also what attract, as Magdalena said, what attract people, voters to the KK. It is very interesting that the electoral force of the KK the last 30 years is stabilized around 5 to almost 10%. It's not 10%, but it's close to something like that, which is very impressive because, of course, from one side, this shows a not so strong party. It's not a party that could participate, of course, to the administration, to coalition governance. The party has decided a long time ago to be completely isolated, to denounce all the other parties as parties of the system, and the KK presents itself as the true anti-systemic revolutionary communist party, the only party that proposes a radically different path for Greece. So there are different kinds, I can say, of linkages between its electorate, its electoral audience, and the party. There is one link is, of course, this revolutionary, I can say, memory, identity, the identity of the past, the party which had a lot of martyrs, heroes, revolutionary during the Greek Civil War and before and after, people who was for many years in jail, in exiles, and they suffered for the cause of communism. This culture of the martyr, I can say, which is very Christian, very Orthodox culture, and this culture is very promoted by the party. So the party is the people of the old heroes, the old martyrs, of the socialist, the communist cause. The other trait that characterized its electorate, it's anti-European, anti-Western, very traditionally, I can say, attitude. And on this ground, we could see a lot of traditional conservative people not necessary to vote the KK, but I could say to feel a kind of sympathy, of attraction for the anti-Western attitudes and the steady anti-Western. I mean, the party has the same a coherent attitude against the EU and against the NATO organization and against the West in general for all these last 35 years. So, and this is something very important culturally speaking, because on this ground, the KKE could create links, bonds between traditional anti-Western cultures cultivated also by the Orthodox Church in Greece, by very traditional conservative circles, groups of thinking, of thought, etc., social groups that see the West as the enemy of the Greek Orthodox culture, and these people could see the KKE as a party that insists on this cultural and political tradition of anti-Western attitude. And there is a third aches that relate the links the Cook way, which is electorated, it's of course trade unions, which is very, very traditionally in the communist culture. KKE's activism is really rooted in a particular sector of Greek society, and one of this sector is, of course, traditional working class, and particularly working class in some traditional sectors of the economy, like heavy industry, for example, which the KKE has a lot of impact in this ground. It is. I finish with this and the today's electoral impact of the KKE, saying that Kukue presents itself as a party which is saying all the time the same things, and this they promote as themselves as a decent party, as a revolutionary party, which never betrayed its original way of thinking, its original values, its original ideology. Second question, you have absolutely right, Magdalena, about what you was thinking on why the KKE leaders and followers were attracted more for many years more in theoretical issues in comparison to the Polish leaders, for example, that were more bureaucrat and were attracted more in, I can say, practical organizational issues. And of course, because the KKE for many years had no governmental task. It was a party absolutely in a marginal situation. So what we see in the KKE, in the Greek communism, is very typical in the Western communist parties, that those parties had a lot of quarrels, conflicts, internal conflicts about theoretical issues, strategic issues, the role of revolution or the reforms, of course, the relations with the center, etc., etc. So the answer is this: the Greek communist leaders were outside the government. They didn't have power in reality, so they had more time, if you like, more space to think about theoretical ways, about theoretical issues, excuse me. The Macedonian issue is, the Macedonian question is by far the most important question in the history of Greek communism. And I tried quickly, because I know that those things are too complicated and we don't have hours and hours of time to discuss them. But it is important to say that when we talk about the Macedonian question, we need to think the national question in the Comintern debates. And here is something very important. What is the national question? The national question arises in the Comintern, arises in Moscow, when after the first 2 years after the Bolshevik Revolution, when the first dreams of a global revolution, that the Bolshevik Revolution would ignite in the rest of the world. So after 2 years and the failure of the revolts in different countries, Hungary, Germany, Finland, and so on, the Bolsheviks, the Comintern leaders, thought that they could exploit the national issue, the national question, as they did during the Bolshevik Revolution, as they did in Russian Empire, in the Balkans and Central Europe. And what was the idea? It was very simple. The idea is to push different movement of self-determination, minorities, to reclaim their independence and to try to to create national revolutions in multinational states. And what exactly I can give you examples supporting the Croat national independence and the Slovene independence in the cadre or in the framework of the old Yugoslavia. The Macedonian independence in the framework of Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, and of course Greece, which is more complicated because here we have also international entanglements too difficult. The Slovak case in the Czechoslovak state, etc., etc. So the decision was at that moment to support nationalist demands coming from minorities in Eastern Europe. It was not an easy decision because many communists, many socialists, radical socialists at that time, thought the nationalist demands, the demands for self-determination of the minorities as very bourgeois demands, as nationalist demand, and the socialists, the communists at that time didn't think that the national and the international could go together. So the Comintern thought that this was a strategic decision, making the national issue as a central issue in the Balkans and Central Europe. The communists could believe at that moment that it could be possible to create revolutionary conditions and to transform a national revolution to a socialist revolution after, to create the conditions for the overthrow of the reactionary regimes, as they call them in Europe. So this situation led for some years the communists in the Balkans and Central Europe to support the secession, the divide, the split of their multinational countries. The Yugoslav Communist Party supported for during the 20s and the early 30s supported the Croatian case, this Slovenian case, the Macedonian case. The Greek Communist Party supported the Macedonian case, the Bulgarian Communists the same, and so on, so on. But in 1934, it's a very important moment for the whole change. What happened in 1934? And it is something that we tend to forget many times. It is the moment that the Soviet Union entered in the Society of Nations. It's the moment that Nazi Germany left a Society of Nations and Soviet Union demand to be a member of the organization that was denounced by the Bolsheviks for so many years because this was a capitalist international order, etc., etc. At this moment, in 1934, 1935, and it is the Stalinist years, all the communist parties in Eastern Europe, in Southeastern Europe, and Central Europe changed immediately their strategies, and they adopted new policies that supported the unity of their countries. And they did this because the only possibility for the Soviet Union to enter, to be member of the Society of Nations, it was to accept the international order that came after World War I. So the Macedonian question, because was remained a very complicated issue because it linked, as we know, three countries, remained for many years, not only for the Greeks, but for the Bulgarians and the Yugoslavs, a hot question. And the question took a new life, if you like, after the Tito-Stalin split. During that moment, new, I can say, conflicts appear around this question, but this time it was not the communists against the reactionary capitalist regimes, but it was some communist parties against one communist party, which was the Yugoslav. One, so Bulgaria, Soviet Union, of course, against Yugoslavia. It is important to say, and I end with this, that the national question, so the Macedonian question, in reality was a tool, was an instrument in this for the Soviet Union and for the foreign policy of the Soviet Union. We should think more as an issue of an instrumental, I can say, use of this issue rather than a principal issue, something that really the communists believe on this. Now, the question which is related to the Macedonian issue is about the relations between the Communist Party of Yugoslavia and the Communist Party of Greece during the war, 1941, 1945. I can say quickly, because it's also a very complicated relation, but the Greek communists, they admire, and at the same time, they feel jealous, but also in a contradictory place towards the Yugoslavian communists. They admire Tito because Tito created a very powerful, giant, respectful, famous resistance organization, resistance movements, and of course, everyone in Europe at that time talk about Tito's guerrilla the partisan organization, the partisan war of Tito. So the Greeks, in many ways, they try to follow the path of the Yugoslav party and follow the path of the Yugoslav resistance movement, the communist resistance movement. And they tried also a lot to create strong relations between the two parties. They felt at that period that they could create ambitions about help, about a Yugoslav help on the Greek Communist Party, on the Greek organization. The problem, the thorn between the two parties was the Macedonian issue, because many times Tito pressed the Greeks, the Greek communists, to adopt and to speak loudly about Macedonian independence and about the Macedonian rights, the Macedonian, I mean the ethnic Macedonian rights in northern Greece, etc., which was very difficult for the Greek communists, because they understood at that time that this question, the Macedonian question, created a lot of problems in the domestic arena for the party. They were in a very, I can say, difficult situation. They were denounced by the other Greek parties as that they betrayed the country, they promote the split of the country, etc. So the Greek communists felt that Tito was too pressed, I can say. He pressed a lot on this issue, and he exaggerates about his interest on this issue. There is a letter between the Soviets and the Greeks and on this issue in the 40s, and one Greek leader said, for 20,000 ethnic Macedonians, we risk to lose all the organization we succeed to create during those time. And it's something that it's difficult to accept for us, he said. It's very interesting. So I can say that complicated relations between the two parties, admiration from one part, from the Greek communists towards the Yugoslav, but from the other, competitive relations specifically on this issue. Of course, when the Tito-Stalin split happened, the Greek communists and Zachariadis, there was no question they were loyal to Stalin, even if they knew that this split will lead to catastrophic results. They decided to be loyal to Stalin and the Soviet Union. As far as it concerns left opposition, first of all, I would like to correct this Cornelius Castoriadis, the famous Greek philosopher who was living in Paris for a long time, was arrested. It was not in 1940s, it was in 1936, 1937, but not by communists, but by the Metaxas regime, a fascist regime of that time. Metaxas was a military man who imposed a dictatorship between 1936 and 1941 until the moment the Germans entered in Greece during the Second World War. So Cornelius Castoriadis was arrested by Metaxas authorities. And the left-wing opposition, in reality, what we call left-wing opposition, the KKE, it's a Trotskyist opposition in reality. And we could talk a lot about this issue and how this what happened. The most important thing, what I need to stress on this issue is that in reality, what happened in the Communist Party during the 20s in Greece was absolutely related to what happened in the Soviet Union. I mean, there is a clear, direct reflection of the conflict between Stalin and Trotsky in the USSR to the Greek to the Greek party and all the other parties. I mean, this is very typical everywhere in Europe, where inside the communist parties, we see during the 20s, we see the reproduction of the Tito Trotsky's debate conflicts in their in the different communist parties. So the left wing opposition was created in the end of the 20s, in 27, when a particular group of people and important number was put outside the party by the Stalinist majority, and it was immediately it was reflecting directly the events in the Soviet Union. There are some books in Greek language. If you can read the Greek language, I can send you this book. I don't know if you are able to do this. I'm not sure that we can find books talking about the left wing opposition in the KKs in English or French or German language. But if you could send me an email, I could. I try to find some papers, or if there are, we cannot find. Okay, thank you. I will send you the references that you could find and read about left-wing opposition. I think I answered to all questions.
Yes, for all four. So are there any other questions or comments? Someone want to say something? It's the last chance, I guess. Mariusz Zajączkowski, thank you for the answer, Professor, for his question. So thank you, Professor, for your great.
I get the question, if I may.
Okay, sorry.
Professor, this is a little bit off topic, but this is the concern of mine, which is coming from my personal background, because I was growing up and I'm living in the region of Poland, Lower Silesia, which is the region where the most of the Greeks were coming after the Second World War. After the Civil War, and actually that was the central decision, obviously, to settle in the areas which were not densely populated. And my question is quite simple, because what were the relation between these people who came during the Civil War and right after the Civil War to Poland with the party itself? How do you have like some knowledge on their political activities, not only in Poland but also in this global dimension, which you were talking a lot about, in relation with the Greek Communist Party and with the other parties in the region? Thank you.
Very, very interesting question, and it is a field that it is recently studied in different countries, not only by Greek, but different historians. For example, I know some Polish historians who wrote on these relations between the Greek refugees and the Communist Party in different countries of the Eastern Bloc. I can say that there are different kind of relations, and these relations are related to generation. The first generation, the generation of refugees that came in the Eastern countries after, in 48, 49, after the defeat of the Communist Party in the Civil War, they had very strong relations. I can say they were absolutely dependent on the party. In reality, on those countries, we could say a kind of that there was a kind of micromanagement, governmental type between the KK leaders in the different countries and in the center in Bucharest and Romania, and the small Greek communities in each country, because the Greeks, they didn't know the language. They didn't know, so they didn't had any kind of contact with the authorities of with the host societies. They didn't know Polish, they didn't know Hungarian, they didn't know any of those languages. Second, they were very, very isolated from the social environment. It was very difficult to find a job. They didn't know the language, but also they didn't know all, I could say, the characteristic, the issues that are important to be assimilated in a country. And also, it is important to say that the first generation of people who came in Eastern Europe as political refugees, as we call in Greece, they had a very low educational level, very poor people coming from Greek periphery, villages, farmers, the majority of them, and with very low educational level. So the only agent that they felt that it could be protected, it could be hear them, their problems, their dreams, solve everyday small or bigger problems, if you like, it was the party. So for the first generation, the relations were very close, and in reality, it was not, how can I say this? The party didn't play at that time an ideological or theoretical role, and this we come through this to Magdalena's comments in the beginning. They didn't discuss theoretical issues. They tried to solve very practical issues. To how they organize their everyday life in Poland, to find jobs for the refugees, to find schools for the kids, to find hospitals for all those people who had injured from the war, etc., etc. So the relation between refugees and the party was very close. But in the second generation, and when we call second generation of refugees, we mean people who was born in the host countries, and also people who came with their parents or alone in a very early age, I mean kids. So this generation, um, it's a completely different story, because they grew up in the different host countries. They didn't had a lot of relation with Greece. The only Greek they speak was the Greek of their families. So many times they didn't know to write and read in Greek, but they knew write and read in the host languages, in Polish, in Hungarian, etc. So this generation didn't feel very attached to the party. The second generation, they took distances, and in many cases, they were assimilated in the host countries, and they were really very, very distant from the party's ideas, projects, dreams, and of course, organization. And many times we have seen also that this second generation is very, how can I say, influenced by the developments in the host countries. I mean, the case of Poland is characteristic. I mean, all the crises of Polish communism were felt by the second generation of Greek refugees, and we have seen different kind of reactions in this community in relation to what happened in the countries. For example, in Czechoslovakia, when the Soviets invaded the country in 1968, a new generation of Greek refugees how can I say, felt very, very negative feelings against the Soviets and the Communist Party, like the majority, I mean, of Czechoslovak citizens. So the answer is it depends from generation to generation. And there is a trend. In the beginning, the relations were very strong, and so Greek communities of refugees were dependent to the party for their everyday life. But from the second generation, and of course more to the third generation of refugees, the situation became more, I can say, the relation more distant.
Okay. So any other questions or comments? I can't see. So thank you, Professor, for your great speech, and all of you for joining us today. I would also like to thank the organizers from the Richard Fives Laboratory, for Dr. Bartłomiej Krzysztan and Wojciech Łysek for invitation and opportunity to chair this meeting. It was a great pleasure for me, and thank you.
And in the name of the laboratory, I would like also to thank Professor for being with us, and Dr. Semczyshin for chairing this interesting event. And obviously, as always, thank you for all the participants. And I would like to invite all of you to the next meetings coming up within the framework of the laboratory, some of them in Polish, some of them in English. Yeah, so thank you very much, and have a good afternoon.
Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you again.
Thank you, Professor. Bye.
Bye.